Let's talk a little Colorado today on the 10-12 podcast. David Rumsey of Front Office Sports joins us to talk about their decision to end the relationship with their NIL collective, plus a shout out to Coach Prime for a first for the Colorado football team. And we're talking Big 12 men's and women's tennis. We're previewing the season with John Parsons of No Ad, No Problem podcast coming up on the 10-12.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome to the 10-12, the podcast that covers all 16 teams in the Big 12 Conference. We are the flagship show, the 10-12 Network. Find every show on the network at 1012network.com. And of course, we are partners with Sports Social, Europe's biggest sports podcast network. I'm your host, Phillip. Thank you for joining us today for a midweek episode I hadn't planned on. We were going to hold midweeks until we got to softball season, and Thursdays would be all about softball. But you know, sometimes stuff comes out and I go, I want to do an interview. I want to talk about that, which is the whole reason that today's episode even exists at all. NCAA tennis gets underway very soon. Preseason rankings, preseason polls are out. So we're going to talk Big 12 men's and women's tennis with John Parsons of No Ad, No Problem podcast. He does a great job covering college tennis throughout the entire year. Really good conversation if you're in Oklahoma State, TCU, Arizona State fan. And he's got a clip talking about Big 12 men's tennis. I clipped it. I put it out on social. Yeah, I have to because it's really good. And it's a reason you should be paying attention to Big 12 men's tennis this year. Then David Rumsey of Front Office Sports is going to join us. Colorado joins UCF among the first schools to stop using collectives ahead of the impending changes to college athletics via the House settlement. We're going to talk about all of that. NIL collective, kind of the future of it. David wrote an article covering that news story, and so we brought him on to talk about it. So just not football, not basketball, just a few things here that were worth having a conversation about in regards to the Big 12. Speaking of Colorado, when Coach Prime took the job at Colorado, he received plenty of criticism, including here. And I still believe that at the time that criticism was deserved for the way he handled his players or players on the roster and the way he talked about things. First opinions play a big role in how we view people. First impressions, I think, sometimes matter more than they should. And sometimes are hard to get rid of. Oftentimes are hard to get rid of. But if we're going to criticize someone for the things that he says that we don't like, we do need to give those people credit for the things they do that are positive. And look, Coach Prime has done wonders at Colorado through 2 seasons. We've got to see how he can continue to sustain that with his stars gone heading into next season. But I do want to give Colorado a ton of credit and Coach Prime a ton of credit. They posted a video, the Colorado football social media accounts, in which they stated that Colorado football had a over 3.0 GPA for the first time ever. Now, we can spend time discussing why the fact that the football program had never had over a 3.0 GPA before and why that might not be great, but we've got to give due credit to the fact that that was something that was important, something they focused on. And as Coach Prime says in the video, that has continued to grow and rise that GPA each quarter. Full credit to them. That is awesome. That's exactly the kind of things you want to see at a football program, that you're having success both on the field and off of it. So credit to Colorado. Credit to Deion Sanders. We'll see if he's still at Colorado once the NFL coaching cycle is done. I'm leaning toward he will still be the head coach of Colorado. Having his name attached to these jobs is not a bad thing. I mean, look, there's a reason Matt Campbell does it all the time, having his name attached to Ohio State and Michigan and USC and insert other programs right now to the Chicago Bears. And this is all part of the game. And it certainly doesn't help your reputation and help get the word out about you to people who may not care as much about Colorado or Iowa State. Now, in the case of Deion Sanders, everyone is aware of Colorado and Deion Sanders. But that doesn't mean you can't continue to do things to keep your name out there. So we'll absolutely keep an eye on that and just see what happens. Shout outs to some Big 12 legends. College Football Hall of Fame class for 2025 was announced. Among the entrants for this year, Texas Tech quarterback Graham Harrell, of course, was part of the Big 12. Texas defensive back Michael Huff, who was part of the Big 12. Congrats to both of them. Running back Steve Slayton of West Virginia, pre-Big 12 days, but West Virginia, part of the Big 12, still want to give him his shout out. And speaking of programs or coaches who never stepped foot in the Big 12, but had an impact on a Big 12 school, Urban Meyer, during his time at Utah, Urban Meyer will be joining the College Football Hall of Fame in his first time on the ballot, as well as, of course, Nick Saban, who I don't think we have to spend any time telling anybody who he is. So some great entrants into the College Football Hall of Fame for 2025. Shout out again, Graham Harrell, the only one on this list who played for a school that was in the Big 12 at the time and is in the Big 12 still to this day. So, hooray. If you guys haven't, go to 1012network.com. 1012network.com, TEN12, the word network.com. You'll find links to every show on the network. Go check them all out. Go check every single show out. I would really appreciate it if you would just take some time and try some new stuff this offseason. We've got just about everybody covered. And if you're listening to this podcast, obviously you are at the time, if you're a first-time listener, long-time listener, whatever, we are, 7 ratings away, 7 people rating the show on iTunes away from 100 ratings. And so if you could just take 2 minutes, if you listen on iTunes and have never left us a rating or a review before, just go down, click that 5 stars, and if you feel like it, leave us a review, a positive review. What do you like about the show? You don't even have to say that. Just what do you love about the Big 12? What school are you a fan of? I would appreciate positive words, but I'd be perfectly fine with like, hey, I just am here because I like when he says nice things about my school, Iowa State or Texas Tech or West Virginia. Or, hey, you know what? I'm so glad that my school, Colorado, is back in the Big 12. Those comments are perfectly fine. I am great with those. Go ahead and leave them. But if you can go give us 5 stars, please. I hate asking for this stuff, but it's part of it. Just part of the way this works. So I have to. If you are listening on Spotify, you can leave us a rating there. If you're listening on YouTube, do us a favor, please. Like this video. Leave us a comment. I try and respond to as many of them as I can, except for the ones that are just like overly critical and negative. Like it's important. Like I'm doing my best. Okay. And subscribe to the channel. We continue to try to grow that. We will do hoops on Sunday night. Jamie and Andy will be back. So Monday's episode, all Big 12 hoops. That's all we're going to talk about. Men's and women's side both. A lot to get to here in the middle of January. And of course, the softball season starts in like 3 weeks. 3-4 weeks. We're getting there close. So Leah and Eric will be back. We'll be doing those every Thursday. So I'm excited. I'm excited for that. I really am. I love our softball coverage. I'm very excited. And hey, if you are an Extra Point subscriber, a reader, we're going to be doing some advertising in there. February and March and April a few times. So I'm really excited about that opportunity. We're going to try and get Matt Brown on the show during that stretch as often as we can about anything that's related to Big 12 teams, Big 12 fans, anything that connects to the Big 12 in any way, or maybe just general college football, college sports business, because no one does a better job covering the business of college athletics than Matt Brown and Extra Points newsletter. So if you aren't a subscriber, go do so. Let's see, anything else I need to plug or pull? Look, again, just things that I like. I like to support people who do good work. It's why we have Shahan on here all the time. It's why we have Ari Temkin. It's why we have a lot of the same guests over and over again. Of course, if you've listened to me talk about Volume Pigs before, great newsletter, comes at things from a college fantasy football angle, but he puts out regular running back depth charts. You can subscribe for like $1. and it's absolutely fantastic content, especially if you like Big 12 or college football running backs. Volume Pigs, it's on Substack. Go check it out. All right, I think that's everything. We've got 2 great interviews. I cannot wait for you to hear them. Please stick around for both. Again, leave us 5 stars and a review on iTunes. It would really help us out and be a great way to kick off 2025 by getting us to 100 ratings and keep that number going up, and some new reviews as well. So 2 great interviews. Let's get to it. Look, we talk about this all the time. The business of college athletics is ever changing. It changes the only constant. And that is what's going to be a big storyline this year as we wait for the House settlement and the deal there to be finalized. Obviously, that settlement, which is expected to be finalized later this year, schools are going to be allowed to pay their athletes up to $22 million annually through revenue sharing. So schools are preparing for that in different ways. One of those is distancing themselves from NIL collectives. That is what Colorado has done. And so we're very excited to have David Rumsey of Front Office Sports here, who wrote the article for Front Office Sports about that. David, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Phillip, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I mean, as we know, Colorado is not the first school to disconnect from their NIL, separate from their NIL. Obviously, this one is interesting because Colorado had just combined their NIL collectives into one like 10 months ago into one organization that was, sorry, I forgot the name of it, 5430 Alliance. And now 10 months later, bye guys, we'll see you as they prepare for the changes that are coming. What are your thoughts kind of on what Colorado's decision is here and kind of compared to some of the other schools that have been preparing in this similar fashion?
Yeah, Colorado is a really interesting case. I think we've all been enamored with what's going on in Boulder for the past 2 years since Deion Sanders became head coach, obviously for a number of different reasons is why they're interesting. But yeah, obviously NIL is huge for them. I mean, with 2 stars like Travis Hunter and Shador Sanders the past couple of seasons. Obviously, they're getting a lot of outside NIL deals, but what we're kind of talking about here is a school collective, which everybody, all the big universities and small ones have these collectives that you're alluding to. That's really more for the maybe lesser known players or guys that aren't getting those huge brand deals with a Nike or Adidas or Delta Airlines or whatever. This is just a way for players to get a little bit of cash for coming to school because the situation has been so murky. So, yeah, I think in general, this is a sign of where a lot of schools are headed. And if you talk to people within college athletics, I think they might not be too surprised and they would tell you, yeah, I think a lot of schools are going to start heading in this direction with no official outside third party collective, if you will, but really just more funneling more money straight to the players.
I think that differentiation is good because I think this gets really confusing, especially the further you get away from how much you pay attention to college athletics every single day. Right now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're a diehard Big 12 fan. Maybe it's your first time, maybe it's not. Maybe you pay attention to every single thing that comes out. Maybe you don't. Obviously, NIL will still exist. NIL is just the name, image, and likeness. It's the ability to make money off of you as a person. Players will still be able to sign deals, media deals, and sponsorships, and those kinds of things with companies on their own. The collectives, of course, have been the primary, let's say, money-making tool to, I'm going to use air quotes here, pay players to join your team. We see it where, every Texas Tech, every member of the football team automatically earns a certain amount of dollars. I think it's like 2,500 or 25. I don't know. But this is the collectives have been the third party arms to collect the funds to pay the players once they're on the roster or to lure them to the roster, even though that's not how it's supposed to work. Yada, yada, yada. And so as schools look to basically make players employees, they don't need a third party anymore. They want to control that, which is when we've seen a lot of athletic directors talk about it would be better for the schools in their minds if they were able to handle everything internally as opposed to having a third party that you're partnering with that you have little control over who could be doing things that may not be up to the standards you would like to hold.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's important to note that, like you said, if it's a school like where they're just giving every single player like a base minimum from their collective, which it's important to note that collective is technically made up of donors. That's why I said it's a third party or outside of institution. That's not a huge sum if everybody is getting $2,500 or even $25,000, because as we know, if the House settlement does pass, schools are going to be able to spend up to roughly $22 million per season across all their sports. And we know that the majority of that is going to be going to football and a little bit to men's basketball and a little bit spread out everywhere else. So that's where money, that those checks are going to be going to players. Maybe it's in the form of 50,000 for an offensive lineman, or, then you go up and up and up for, how much of a star you are, how much of an impact you make if we're talking about football here. But, it's still going to be murky because, okay, they distribute that much of their athletic revenue to the players, right? But then they can just ask for more donations from those same donors that were giving to the collective in the first place. And oh, by the way, the best players are still going to be able to go, the well-known ones are still going to be able to go get third-party NIL deals from a major brand. So they're not going to only be getting paid by the school, which will have a de facto salary cap, but the biggest names, the biggest brands of players will still be able to go get extra money on top of whatever the school gives them.
So you had some interesting quotes in your article as well. Were there any in particular that stood out to you as maybe unique or different about this situation with Colorado and its distancing itself from its collective?
Yeah, it was like I said, I think a lot of people in college athletics might not be too surprised, but Rick George, who's the athletic director at Colorado, he sent out this email to Colorado fans and constituents and everybody. And he said that giving to third party collectives like the 5430 Alliance, he cited it directly. He said that's going to be unnecessary now, which, like you mentioned at the beginning, they just combined their other collectives into this one less than 10 months ago, and now they're shifting again. I think that just showcases how fast moving and fluid the situations around NIL are across the country. People don't really know what's going on, and it's only been a couple of years since it was even first allowed on a federal level, and there's still so much to be decided, so much so that Colorado 10 months ago thought, hey, let's build this collective, and then now it's, hey, let's get rid of this collective because we're going to pay the players directly.
But you and I were talking before this. Colorado is not the first school to do this, obviously. You mentioned a couple in the article. One of those also is UCF, who has done this something very similar. Everyone's kind of doing this a little bit differently. In your mind, is there a right way, a wrong way? Which way do you feel like as we have seen early on, because many schools are just waiting to see what comes from the settlement and the final decision and what some of the rules and things are put in place. What are just your thoughts on how schools are handling this kind of overall?
Yeah, sure. I think in general, if you're a more smaller school, middle of the pack, not, top 10 revenue in the country, if you will, I think it is going to just be most efficient if this house settlement does pass to, ask for donations directly to the school, and then you pay out your players up to that 22 million, how much ever you're comfortable with. I think if you want to be competitive, you'll go all the way up to 22 million for your best sports. And I think that's probably the most efficient, because that's going to be pretty much all the money that you're going to be able to get to players, unless you have a breakout star and he or she is getting a lot of money from some sort of other brand deal. But I think in the case of like Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State, their donor bases can be so big that they still might want to have a third party NIL collective that can keep funneling money to players outside of just the money that's coming in from revenue sharing. I mean, we look at Carson Beck, who just transferred from Georgia to Miami. The collective there in Miami is playing a huge part in getting him paid with numbers of 4 million, and we reported he's made up to $10 million over the past 12 months from all kinds of deals. So I think collectives will still have a place, but it might be dwindling and maybe only for the elite schools.
As I mentioned, UCF similarly has separated itself from its collective. It was actually the first Power Four school to do it. They announced it back in November, I
November, yeah.
believe, and that change will kind of take place in January 1st, 2025 this year. I'm sorry, July 1st,
Right.
2025 this year is going to be a big day. Obviously, it's when we start seeing shufflings of realignment and things that happen. And July 1st has been this like momentous day in college athletics. I feel like every year for the past
Yeah,
few years with
exactly.
realignment here and realignment there and decision here, and that's when the new year starts. So major changes occur. Now we're going to have another major change. Like at some point, July 1st is just going to have to be this like college athletics holiday where we all just stop whatever we're doing and focus on whatever the big change is. Um, as this continues, and we'll kind of wrap up on this, Colorado, UCF joining, as you mentioned, Alabama and Michigan State, I believe, is one of the other ones that have done this so far. I mean, it feels like this is not the last school who's going to announce something like this, and we're going to continue to see it as we get closer and closer and closer to that date. It's expected that the House settlements it's going to go into place. Players are going to become employees. What are the things that you're kind of looking out for, keeping an eye on as we get closer and closer to that July 1st date?
Yeah, I think it's just going to be interesting to see how the schools split up that money, that up to $22 million, if that's the final figure, that they can give to players. We saw Texas A&M come out with, they're very public with, what their split was going to be, and it was majority football, a big chunk to men's basketball, and then a little bit for women's basketball, and everybody else kind of 1% or less of that 22 million that's available for players. So I think it's going to be interesting. Is there a school that's going to go all in on football, 99% or something, and then not give money to any other players? Is there a school that's going to pay maybe those Olympic sports, non-revenue sports, more money to try to be more competitive there? I don't know if that's the best strategy, but it is going to be interesting because I don't think it's going to be exactly the same at every single campus. And whether it's they want to be competitive in basketball instead of football, or they want to be competitive in women's basketball, or whatever it is, it's going to be interesting to see how schools choose to allocate that money, especially if they maybe have donors give money to kids through collectives or other brand deals on the outside.
The other thing I'll be interested to see here is obviously with collectives, we get no information. Like they are not required to provide public information as far as how much they're collecting, where it's going, how it's being
Yeah.
spent. When you get public institutions who are going to be taking over this stuff and bringing everything in-house, that information is now going to be something that you can FOIA, you can get access to, and you can request. It will be interesting to get some of the information from athletic departments across the country and how they're divvying it up, how they're handling their 22 million or however much they're going to spend. I'm going to be very interested to start getting some of that information that I really think we've been wanting to help kind of understand some of this a little bit better from just the dollars and cents standpoint.
Yeah, and I do hope that they're transparent about it and we can get it quickly because as we know, sometimes you don't get information about a college athletic department until it's final financial report or tax statement comes out from the prior year, and sometimes that's 14 months down the road, and we're looking at numbers that are way in the past, and that's not always the most helpful. But yeah, so I hope it's fast. I hope everyone's transparent. I'm sure some will be, some won't be, but it will be interesting either way.
I would keep a close eye on your local journalists and people who cover the sport locally because they're going to be the ones for each
Absolutely.
school going to try and get that information as quickly as they can. Are going to have it far earlier than USA Today or anybody else. However, David, man, I really appreciate you hopping on and talking with us about this. Just the business of college athletics just gets more and more interesting and more complex every day. And the more we can know about it, the better, I think, as fans, that we can be less, I don't know, less angry, less frustrated, less assuming, less just relying on John down the street who's got a Facebook thread that everybody loves. So, David, where can we go and continue to get great information about college athletics and the future of it?
Yeah, so definitely check out frontofficesports.com. Follow us on all our social channels on X, Instagram is really good, and on TikTok as well, Facebook. And then I write, I'm one of our newsletter writers for our twice daily flagship newsletter, which it's called The Memo. It's free to sign up for. Just give us your email and you'll get it in the morning and the afternoon every day and get more stories around college sports and the business of sports in general.
David, again, appreciate it, man. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks.
Basketball season may be going strong, but one of my favorite sports is about to get underway. That is tennis. I love college tennis. If you haven't been to a college tennis match, you really, especially if you're a student and you don't go and experience every single sporting event at least once in your time there, especially if you're there for 4 years, like you might as well take advantage of it because a lot of times this stuff is free and it can be absolutely incredible. And college tennis live is so much fun. And so I'm very excited to help kind of preview the Big 12 season that we've got about to kick off. Thank you to John Parsons for joining us today of the No Ads, No Problems podcast. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. And thanks for spreading the college tennis gospel. I feel like a lot of people might think you go to a match, it's one-on-one, it's quiet, you have to be prim and proper. But as you know, that is not the case at all. It's a very fun, loud, rowdy environment. So certainly encourage all of your listeners to try and at least show up to one match.
It is energetic, it is exciting. And look, Big 12 schools have done a really good job, especially when your teams are good. I know Baylor matches are fantastic. Coach Woodson has built a great program there on the men's side, and those matches are exciting. They've got good crowds for those things. Like I tell everybody, look, even if it's not your favorite sport, experience it once, because worst thing that happens is you try it and you're like, no, it's not for me. But you can find things, oh man, this is a lot more exciting than I thought it was. And I think tennis is a perfect example of that, especially with some of the programs that we have in the Big 12 who are very, very good. And that's what we want to talk about today, is kind of preview the season, both on the men's and the women's side. John, tell everybody a little bit, though, about the No Ads, No Problems podcast before we get going.
Yeah, No Ad, No Problem is a podcast I started about 3 years ago to focus specifically on college tennis coverage. So during the season, we produce weekly or bi-weekly episodes covering the results and previewing some of the upcoming matches. And then during the off season, of which there's actually very little of in college tennis because there is action in both the fall and the spring, we will cover former college players who have transitioned to the pro tour, of which we are seeing so many. So one of the other benefits of attending a college tennis match is you are very likely to see a future pro that you might see in a Grand Slam event. At the Australian Open this year, we had 29 former college tennis players in the main draw of singles across men and women. So that's a little about No Ad, No Problem. I'm a former college tennis player, briefly in Division III, and have had a passion for it since I graduated. So do this as a way to highlight and grow the sport.
Love it. Anyone who has the interest in sharing their passion with an effort to grow it, I think is awesome. So thrilled to have you with us today, John. Let's start on the women's side. I mean, I got to talk about Oklahoma State, who went undefeated during the regular season last year. Incredible year for them, obviously disappointing in the postseason in the way that it ended. But they start this year. The ITA, Intercollegiate Tennis Association, has them preseason ranked number 4. They were picked as the favorite. They received 15 out of 16 first place votes in the preseason Big 12 poll. Obviously, the head coach for Oklahoma State not picking his own team. He chose Arizona State, but everybody else picked Oklahoma State. Does the Big 12 run through Stillwater and Oklahoma State again this season?
Yeah, it absolutely does. This is Oklahoma State's title to lose. You talked about the incredible season they had last year. So many firsts for that program. First time reaching number 1, first time reaching and winning the ITA Indoor Championship, ends in heartbreaking fashion in the Sweet 16 in the NCAAs, but they return their entire top 3 from that roster. Now they lose a very successful bottom half of that lineup, but we can talk about some of the players they bring in, but they reload with a significant amount of talent to the point where there is a very clear delta between the talent and depth of that Oklahoma State team versus the rest of the Big 12 women's team.
Wait, obviously, as you said, you believe it does run through Oklahoma State. I mean, who's there in the Big 12 to really challenge them this year? If it's not Oklahoma State, who is it?
I think you look to 3 teams. I think you have Baylor, UCF, and Arizona State as sort of that next tier up. Those are also the next 3 teams that were voted in the coaches poll, and I would agree with the coaches in that regard. You have those 3 teams that made some noise either in the fall with some of their new players on that roster or have brought in some transfers or January additions that should make them pretty competitive, both in the Big 12 and on the national stage.
As I mentioned, Oklahoma State's Coach Young, is the one who gave Arizona State his first place vote. They were picked fourth, but I mean, that's high praise, I think.
Can I make a guess here?
Yeah.
I have to imagine there is a Oklahoma State Arizona State connection now. So Arizona State retired their head coach, Sheila McInerney, after 40 years as head coach of Arizona State. Arizona State's new head coach is former WTA top 50 player Jamea Jackson, who also served as a coach with Chris Young at Oklahoma State. So there is probably some bias there in picking Arizona State, given his former assistant coach is now at the helm of the Sun Devils.
Well, then I would also be curious to know where Coach Young ranked Houston, given one of his former top players in Katarina Adamovic is now the head coach at Houston after a very successful tenure at Grand Canyon.
That's true. I mean, the Chris Young coaching tree is starting to get pretty wide. I think that Houston team looks a lot like Grand Canyon team of last year. You mentioned Adamovich moves over to Houston. She brought over a lot of players who transferred from Grand Canyon to Houston. This is still rebuilding there for that Houston program. So not yet in that top tier of Big 12, but maybe Coach Young gives them a vote in the future.
Shout out to our Houston podcast and network, Scott and Holman. They do a great job of covering the Houston women's tennis team. They've had Coach Adamovic over on their show. They're a part of a I forget the exact, I think it's Third Ward Club, I think is what it's called. That is focused on Houston women's tennis. So shout out to them if you're a Houston fan or if you're just a fan of Big 12 tennis. Scott and Holman do a great job covering that program. Okay, so who are some players in the Big 12 this year to keep an eye on as the season progresses?
Well, I'll go two routes with this. One is sort of like, who are your top ranked players in the Big 12 that you might want to catch in action? And I'll give you a few names that I think will be sneaky good and sort of impact their team in an outsized fashion. When you think about like the best Big 12 women's players, it starts with Oklahoma State. You have Anastasia Komar and Obi Kajuru at the top of that lineup. Both have been in the ITA top 10 singles rankings. As you look to some of the players of the other teams I think can compete, there are two Chinese freshmen at Baylor, both who had very successful fall runs. And I think their success in Nadong and Wenfai Yu will be really pivotal to how far that Baylor team can go. On the UCF front, there is Olivia Linser. She was the Big 12 Freshman of the Year last year. She's had some really good results this past December on the pro circuit. And they also bring in a freshman, Aya El Ayuni from Morocco, who is pretty highly ranked on the pro side of things. So those are some of the biggest names in Big 12 women's tennis that you should check out. Some new players to the conference or ones to keep an eye on. Kylie Collins from LSU just transferred into Oklahoma State. She should be making a big impact there. You have Josie Usuru. Now she's interesting because she's a Big West Conference transfer. So she played at Cal State Fullerton, Big West Player of the Year, and she had a fantastic fall. She took out Oklahoma's #1 player this past fall. So those are some new names as well to keep an eye on. And Arizona, probably not one of the top teams in the Big 12, but that's why you look at Usuru to see how far she can bring that program.
We've touched on obviously Oklahoma State and the other three teams you think have a chance to really be the contenders in Baylor, UCF, and Arizona State. If there's a surprise team in the Big 12 this year, maybe it isn't going to win the conference, but finishes in a lot better a spot than was originally anticipated, who would you keep an eye on?
I would keep your eye on BYU. I think they are in that next tier up of teams. And I would say for two reasons, BYU is my pick here. One is that they're still a relatively new addition to the Big 12. Now, not as new as your Arizona schools, but it's a very tough place to play. They are in elevation. The ball tends to fly on the tennis court in elevation. It's a very tough road trip to make. So you could see them scoring a lot of upsets in that environment. And they bring in a transfer from UCF in Grace Levelston, who was one of the top recruits nationally in her high school class. Didn't see much action for UCF, but if they can start to get her going and playing at that level she was at as a junior, they're going to have a really strong top two that can compete with anyone in the Big 12.
Y'all know our policy. We love interconference transfers, keep the talent within the Big 12. So from UCF to BYU works for us. Okay, let's turn our attention over to the men's side. Looking at the ITA preseason poll, TCU picked number 2 in the country. Arizona, forgive me, not too far behind at number 6. Arizona State also getting into the top 25 at number 18. So looking at the men's side of this, TCU versus Arizona. 2 preseason top 10 teams. If you look at the Big 12 preseason poll, TCU got 7 first place votes out of 9. Arizona got the other 2. TCU versus Arizona. I mean, we know what TCU has done. They've won an ITA indoor national championship. They've been very, very good and very, very consistent. Is this TCU should be the front runner here, or do we have a chance for a real battle between the Horned Frogs and the Wildcats?
I think these votes were probably made a little early because a lot has changed for TCU in the past 2 weeks. Most notably, they have announced the return of the 2024 NCAA Most Outstanding Player, Jack Pennington-Jones, who's ATP number 378 right now. He is back for another season at TCU. They also announced that top 5 recruit in the U.S., Cooper Westendike, who would reach number 12 in the junior rankings in the world, is joining early to that program. So he is on campus now. So those 2 additions, I think, very much separate TCU from Arizona. Now, that's not to say Arizona is not going to be very competitive both in conference and nationally. They have 2 top 6 players in the country in Colton Smith and Jay Friend anchoring the top of that lineup. But as it stands right now, your defending NCAA champions are certainly the favorite to win the Big 12.
Okay. Looking through the rest of the conference, Baylor 3rd, Arizona State 4th. Interesting that's different than what we saw in the preseason top 25, unless I just missed Baylor. Nope, I did not. Okay. Oklahoma State at 5, UCF at 6, Texas Tech at 7, BYU at 8, and Utah at 9. Again, only 9 teams on the men's side, all 16 on the women when it comes to tennis. Looking at these teams, who else outside of TCU in Arizona could contend? Or is this a 1A, 1B race and everybody else is just trying to see who can make the postseason?
I think it's 1A with a TCU and a 1B with actually Arizona, Baylor, and Arizona State.
Okay.
I think Arizona, as I mentioned, has that extremely strong top 2. They are going to have depth questions. So they lost a lot of leadership and veterans from the lower half of their lineup, and we'll see if they can kind of work in a lot of their freshmen. It's a very young team. I'm very intrigued by this Baylor team. Baylor is hosting NCAAs this year, and when you look across that roster, they have 1 through 6 players with very little drop off. So sometimes you might see a team like an Arizona with an elite 1-2, and then it drops off pretty significantly. And certainly as we get to the 6th player, not as strong. The drop off between 1 through 6 at Baylor is very minimal. They run 6 deep, although they just don't have that maybe 1 to 2 elite players yet. But I think there's a lot to like about this Baylor team. They also bring in a grad transfer from Romania who has reached an ATP high of 723. They are going to be really good. They should be really good this season. And then the other team that I think rounds this out is Arizona State. They look more like the Arizona model. They have 3 players up top in Murphy Cassone, Bora Artnak, and Mathis Bondaz. Bondaz a transfer from VCU, and then they drop off. So, but I will say generally, Big 12 men's tennis, if you were looking to watch the very best players in men's college tennis, it is in the Big 12. When you look at Universal Tennis Rating, which is a system that sort of rates all tennis players globally, of college men's players, the Big 12 has 3 of the top 4. So there is a lot of incredible talent at the very top of the Big 12 in men's college tennis.
Clipping that. That's getting clipped right there and put out there. That's reason to watch. Like, again, I mentioned what Coach Woodson had done at Baylor. You did those. I have not been able to be to Waco or go to Waco for a match, but I've seen plenty of video. I've seen a lot of stuff out of Waco. When it comes to the men's tennis team, those crowds are awesome and fun and exciting to be a part of. So if you're a Baylor fan, if you're a Baylor student, or just you in Waco and you haven't been to a match yet, go, especially if you can get to a conference one, maybe even a rivalry one. Good luck getting tickets, but like go to one of those matches. You will not regret doing so. You're going to have a good time. Look, and I'm sure TCU is the same way. I'm sure Arizona is probably the same way as well. Man, Arizona State should be fun this year. Yeah, that's it. You already get the rivalry aspect, and then you get two teams.
That's a fun rivalry.
That one feels like it's going to be a 4-3 kind of situation at the end of it, so that should be exciting. You've mentioned quite a few different players. You mentioned 3 of the top 4 in the country essentially are in the Big 12. Who are some other players to watch in the men's side?
I think if you're looking for Baylor to make that really deep run, they are going to need to have that elite player. And the player you look to is Devin Badenhorst, a 6'7" sophomore from South Africa, who has the height, has the athleticism to become one of those top players in college. Great serve, a very fun player to watch. I would also look for Arizona. We talk about maybe the lack of depth there. They bring in a freshman in Zoran Ludowski, who was a former top 50 player in the world in juniors. They're going to need to rely on him. So he's someone to watch if you're an Arizona fan, hoping they can make a deep run. He's someone you want to see playing his best tennis. And then a team we haven't talked about is Oklahoma State on the men's side. So they lost a lot of players from last season, notably the number 1, Tyler Zink. Looking for players to replace him, you have Derek Pham from Australia, who has been with Oklahoma State, not been eligible. He's now eligible. He's had a lot of success on the pro tour. Now it's about translating some of that success into the collegiate season.
Is there a team here outside of that top 4 of TCU, Arizona, Baylor, and Arizona State that could surprise all of us, that could end up in the top 4 or could even push? Obviously not. I think our number 1s are pretty dominant, but is there another team that you feel like could push for the top half and postseason out of Big 12?
It's really tough. I mean, I do think that those are your clear-cut top 4. I think the team that I would look to, which is a team that hasn't yet made deep runs in the Big 12, would be UCF. Their head coach, Lloyd Bruce Burgess, is in his 2nd year of being a head coach. They resemble a Baylor roster configuration where they have 6 very equal level players. And so I would say UCF is a team that you could potentially see scoring some upsets if teams have a bad day, because their level feels like it's going to be very consistent throughout the season. Their floor and ceiling feel very similar. And so if you have an off day, I would expect to maybe see UCF score some upsets, particularly because if you're a team that's going on the road to schools like BYU and then going to Orlando, those are very different environments to play in. And so that can catch a lot of teams off guard.
All right. John, man, this was awesome. That's a great amount of insight on a lot of different teams, men's and women's side. I think that just proves the point of why your show is one to listen to if you're a college tennis fan or want to learn more about it. So remind everybody, where can they find all the great work you do covering college tennis across men's and women's both?
Yeah, I appreciate that. No Ad, No Problem is the podcast. That's also the Instagram handle, so you can follow the Instagram there. I post a lot of clips from attending matches and videos about some of these top players. On Twitter, it's at JTweetsTennis. And so hopefully you can find me across the social platforms there and check out the pod this season.
John, again, appreciate your time, man. This was great. We'll have to get you back on again before the season is over, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks again for covering college tennis.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.